Chapter 12 is on the law of the sea. There are a couple of basic principles here that we need to cover before we delve into more substantive stuff. The basic formula they want you to keep in mind is this. In the context of the law of the sea, jurisdiction follows the flag. Please remember that ships have nationality, and the basic formula is that jurisdiction follows the flag. So, territoriality principle of jurisdiction, if you remember, the territoriality principle of jurisdiction was the highest ranking principle of jurisdiction that took priority over all other claims to jurisdiction. So in the context of the law of the sea, the territoriality principle of jurisdiction belongs to the flag state. In other words, territoriality is derived from nationality of the ship, which belongs to the flag state. Now, in the special case of flags of convenience, which is the business practice of registering a merchant ship in a sovereign state different from that of the ship's owners and flying the state's civil ensign on the ship, in order for this flag of convenience to meet the so-called genuine link between state and the ship, there are three conditions that need to be met. And these are minimum elements that establish that effective and genuine link between the state of registry and the ship. Number one, the state should have a competent and adequate national maritime administration subject to its jurisdiction and control. Number two, the administration should actively be engaged in activities to ensure that ships flying the flag of that state comply with its rules, laws, and regulations. And number three, a satisfactory part of the officer and crew of the ship should consist of the nationals of the flag state. Now, like I said before, the reason why a lot of merchant ships fly flags of convenience is because some countries just impose lower taxes. They have lower wages. They have more lenient safety and health regulations, and it just makes these ships much less expensive to operate if you fly those flags of convenience. For example, all Disney cruise ships are registered and sail under the Bahamian flag. Now, let's delve into the law of the sea. Well, in the context of the law of the sea, there are three conventions on the law of the sea that are normally mentioned in texts of international law. These are called UNCLOS 1, UNCLOS 2, and UNCLOS 3. So UNCLOS 1, which was the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, it convened in 1958 at Geneva, and these were the fruits of that UNCLOS 1 convention. Number one, the convention on the territorial sea and the so-called contiguous zone. Two was Convention on the continental shelf. 3, Convention on the high seas. And 4, Convention on fishing and conservation of living resources of the high seas. And then you had UNCLOS 2 and 3. UNCLOS 2 convened in 1960 and again in Geneva, and didn't result in really any substantive conventions. So we're not gonna cover UNCLOS 2. But UNCLOS 3, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that convened in 1982, resulted in the following conventions. Number one was the delineation of the so-called exclusive economic zones, EEZs. We're going to cover these later. Number two was jurisdiction in the continental shelf. Number three was deep seabed mining. 4, the exploitation regime. 5, protection of the marine environment. And 6, scientific research and settlement of disputes. Now, please remember that maritime jurisdiction from the 16th, 17th to the mid-20th century really included only 3 divisions. So in other words, you only had 3 maritime zones of jurisdiction for these 300-400 years. And these maritime zones of jurisdiction included ports, which were considered part of internal waters, the territorial sea, and the high seas. But things changed in 1945 under the Truman administration, when the United States unilaterally claimed a right to exploit the seabed and subsoil of the continental shelf, and then also the right to manage certain fisheries for purpose of conservation. Predictably, other countries followed suit, and things changed. So in this slide, you see the maritime zones of jurisdiction that were established according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. As you can see here, all these maritime zones are measured from the so-called territorial sea baseline. So this baseline is the line along the coast from which the seaward limits of a state's territorial sea and other maritime zones of jurisdiction are measured. The baseline essentially follows the low water line of a coastal state. So as you can see here, you have the territorial sea, which is ordinarily 12 nautical miles from the baseline. Then you have the contiguous zone, which is 24 miles from the baseline. Then you have the exclusive economic zone, which is normally 200 miles with the maximum of 350 miles. And then the continental shelf, which again could extend up to 350 miles from the baseline. So these are the maritime zones that you need to keep in mind. And then beyond those is obviously the high seas. So according to proximity to the baseline, first you have the territorial sea, 12 nautical miles. The contiguous zone, 24 nautical miles. Exclusive economic zone, ordinarily 200 miles. And then continental shelf, which has a maximum length of 350 nautical miles. Now let's go through those different maritime zones one by one. Now, internal waters obviously covers all water and waterways on the landward side of the baseline. So the coastal state is free to set its own laws, regulate use and use of any resources within its internal waters. Internal waters, foreign vessels have no right of passage. Foreign merchant vessels have implied consent to enter internal waters, but this does not apply to military vessels. So military vessels normally will need prior consent before they could enter internal waters of a state. And you have the Peace of the Port principle, which essentially claims that the coastal state can apply its laws in full to foreign ships in internal waters. But remember that this jurisdiction is not exclusive, and flag state can also try for crimes on board ships. So this is a case of concurrent jurisdiction where the coastal state has jurisdiction as well as the flag state. And these are normally, settled on a case-by-case basis and depending on the nature of the alleged crime. Well, this slides on the ships in distress, and ships in genuine distress. This applies to situations where a vessel is forced, through weather conditions or other emergency, to enter a port or harbor for safety. And normally, ships in distress, under those extraordinary circumstances, these vessels are exempt from duties, fees, customs, and regulations. But remember that the coastal state has the right to refuse entry to ship in distress, and this happened probably most famously in the case of the Prestige, when the Spanish authorities demanded that this badly damaged oil tanker called the Prestige stay away from the coast of Galicia, and the Spanish authorities essentially refused to grant entry to the Prestige. And according to international law, the Spanish authorities were within their rights not to grant entry to this damaged oil tanker. And like I said, contemporary practice is, in the case of ships in distress and whether they should be allowed to enter internal waters, is on a case-by-case basis, and there's no standard procedure or customary international law that applies to these situations. Now, internal waters, in the context of internal waters, Gulf and bays probably are the most pertinent. And the general rule in international law is that when it comes to gulfs and bays, is that if the distance between the headlands of a bay or gulf is less than 24 miles, a state may claim the area as internal waters. This is in keeping with stipulations of UNCLOS 3, United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, number 3, which convened in 1982. Next, maritime zone, territorial waters, or territorial sea, covers 12 nautical miles from the baseline. And like I said, the baseline follows the low water line of a coastal state. In cases where the coastline is deeply indented, has fringing islands, or is highly unstable, normally straight line could be used. So, in the territorial sea, the rule of innocent passage applies. And innocent passage means that transit through territorial waters must be continuous and expeditious, and the ship should obey all safety and navigational rules established by the coastal state. Also, remember here that innocent passage for warships is a little bit different, and in most cases, prior consent is required for innocent passage of warships, although there is no consensus on this. So apart from innocent passage, you have the transit passage clause regime, which which claims that aircraft and ships have same right as in high seas, and submarines can pass underwater through straits. So there's a slight difference between transit passage and innocent passage, where transit passage essentially gives much limited leeway to the transiting aircraft or ship. Normally, transit passage applies to international straits, and in this context, UNCLOS 3 grants continuous and expeditious passage right to those transiting ships. Well, next to the territorial sea, you have another 12 nautical miles, which define the so-called contiguous zone, which is a band of ocean between territorial waters and high seas with more sovereign power, by the coastal state than in high seas. So here, the coastal states, for example, may enforce customs and immigration law. And also, in the context of the contiguous zone, we have this issue of the right of hot pursuit. Well, hot pursuit allows essentially the coastal state to pursue into high seas a ship that it believes violated its laws. And the hot pursuit could begin either in internal waters, in the territorial waters, or in the contiguous zone. Next is this special case of archipelagic states and archipelagic waters. Well, archipelagic states are defined as any internationally recognized state or country that comprises a series of islands that form an archipelago. In this case, in the case of these archipelagic states, the baseline is drawn between the outermost points of the islands, provided that these islands are close to each other. But remember that UNCLOS 3 limits the length of archipelagic baselines to a normal maximum of 100 nautical miles. In the case of very large archipelagos, up to 3% of the total number of baselines may exceed the limit to a maximum of 125 nautical miles. Next, we have the special case of adjacent states. And so these are states with opposite coastlines. In the case of these adjacent states, UNCLOS 3 has stipulated the equitable division of seabed, subsoil, continental shelf, and sedentary fisheries. The only exception to this equitable division is historic internal waters. When it comes to international straits, like I said before, the transit passage doctrine applies, which means that continuous and expeditious transit of a strait between one part of the high seas or EEZ exclusive economic zone and another should be granted. And please note that submarines are free to transit international straits only if they are submerged. So transit passage also applies to submarines as long as they're submerged when they transit through international straits. Now, the delineation of continental shelf is a little bit more complicated, but the basic notion to keep in mind is this: that at least 200 nautical miles from the baseline of the territorial sea, if the continental margin does not stretch that far. So this is the minimum. 200 nautical miles is the minimum that coastal states could claim. 200 nautical miles from the baseline, obviously. But also remember that the outer limit of a country's continental shelf shall not stretch beyond 350 nautical miles of the seabed, of the baseline, or beyond 100 nautical miles from the 2,500 meter isobath. And an isobath is this imaginary line on a map that connects all points having the same depth below the water surface. So this gets a little bit more complicated, but the basic thing to remember is continental shelf is at least 200 nautical miles from the baseline. And on continental shelves, the coastal state has exclusive rights to seabed and subsoil resources. According to UNCLOS 3, a coastal nation has control of all resources on or under its continental shelf, living or non-living. And this is the primary difference between continental shelf and exclusive economic zone. But the coastal state has no control over any living organisms above the shelf that are beyond its exclusive economic zone. This gives it the right to conduct petroleum drilling works and lay submarine cables or pipelines in its continental shelf. So continental shelf is primarily a good, simple way to think about continental shelf is to give the coastal state this privilege of exploring and extracting natural resources from the seabed or subsoil in continental shelf. But UNCLOS number 3 specifically stipulates that the coastal state doesn't have much control over living organisms above the continental shelf. Again, on the question of dividing continental shelf, the equidistance principle applies, and if that's hard to establish, then the equity principle will apply. And finally, you have the exclusive economic zone, which, as I mentioned before, stretches from the baseline out to 200 nautical miles. And here, the coastal state, has control of all economic resources within its exclusive economic zone, and this includes both living and non-living items. So, So it includes, for example, fisheries, it includes mining activities, it includes oil exploration, and any pollution of those resources fall essentially under the jurisdiction of the coastal state. But remember that in the exclusive economic zone, in the EEZ, the coastal state cannot prohibit passage or loitering above, on, or under the surface of the sea. So in other words, the state cannot prohibit, passage of other, warships or vessels, or it cannot engage in activity that constitute loitering. And finally, when you go beyond all those previously mentioned maritime zones of jurisdiction, you hit the high seas. And on the high seas, the active personality principle applies, which is, the nationality principle. And the only exception to the active personality principle on the high seas is, piracy, terrorism, and other jus cogens related breaches of international law. The only other exception is the so-called hot pursuit. Like I said before, hot pursuit is when you initiate pursuing a vessel from your internal waters, from your territorial sea, or from your contiguous zone, and the pursuit extends all the way to the high seas. In that case, you could claim jurisdiction based on the principle of hot pursuit, even on the high seas. And a prime example of this type of pursuit was the I'm Alone vessel. This was a Canadian registered rum runner ship that was intercepted in the Gulf of Mexico, I believe off the coast of Louisiana. So the crew of I'm Alone ship disobeyed orders to stop and were eventually shelled, and the ship was sunk by a U.S. vessel. Now, the U.S. was able to demonstrate in international arbitration that the owners of the ship were Americans, and this was despite the ship's Canadian registry. And the U.S. successfully established jurisdiction through the active personality or nationality principle. Finally, in the context of the law of the sea, you have this emerging issue of global commons. And the global commons are normally defined as planet Earth's unowned natural resources, which fall outside the exclusive jurisdiction of any state. And this is, remember, global commons is actually not limited to planet Earth, because it also covers, outer space or atmosphere above the high seas. And these are normally called a common heritage of mankind sometimes. Some people have argued that even cyberspace may meet the definition of the global commons. Like I said, this is an emerging and developing niche subject area in international law, which is getting continuously thought about by the International Law Commission, and on occasion codified, especially when it comes to the common heritage of mankind. There is emerging codification on how to manage these global commons.